There are days that throw off everything that you think you know about a person, even someone who's close to you. There are people in your life who you trust, who you made a groomsman at your wedding, who you've bared your heart out toward, and he has done the same toward you. And you would like to think that that means that you have some sort of close trust and bond. And from that, solidarity with one another, respect and consideration for one another. You know, especially when you gave him a book specially suited to his research interest because you care about him. You know he's applying for grad schools because you just feel that brotherly connection with him. You do that, all of that. You go through all those things together only to be betrayed. And by that, I mean Cameron just betrayed me in a game of Jackbox Party.
David, you never paid attention to critical game theory.
I thought we had a thing. I thought we could trust each other. Now I'm going to be like those really, really annoying guys in like movies and TV shows who's like mean to literally everyone because someone hurt his feelings once. Like, this is my origin story for that.
This is how David becomes the Joker.
Yeah, I'm like the dang Joker right now, folks. We live in a society made up of people like Cameron.
You know, it's funny. Anybody out there listening, if you David's biggest fault in any game, especially like multiplayer games, is he trusts people. So just buy into that, get him to buy into that trust, and then betray him easy and win profit.
Don't do that. Don't take advantage of me. Don't make one more cynic in the world. There's enough of those already.
Yeah. Sorry.
But not. He ended up winning that game.
I won.
He made the right move. So
no. Because I thought, because you said, "Oh, I'm gonna like not take the money," so I'm like, he's probably taking the money, and so I clicked attack the money. So I thought I want to see us both dead, but then I realized that like when you said it out loud, you actually meant it, and I was like,
I am a man of my word. I am a person of honor and decency, sir.
Well, I got that scrumptious dub though, so that's I won 2 consecutive at that. 2 consecutive trivia murder party. 2 consecutive.
I can't hear David say I'm a man of honor and dignity without hearing it in the voice of, and you won't get besides Caroline will get this reference, the voice of Pierce's dad in the video game episode of Community.
So in terms, I won the trequel and the quadruple.
Yeah, but you're sitting on a throne of lies and deceit, and that is the loneliest throne of all. I hope you're happy with that, good sir.
I don't know. Fucking Queen Elizabeth is sitting on a lies and deceit, and she's almost this close to passing Louis XIV for the longest reigning monarch of all time.
Wait, we're not saying anything bad about the Queen, are we?
I don't know. Cameron, how would our English listeners feel to us making fun of the Queen?
Mixed feelings.
Look, I would never want to belittle the Queen of England, but I will say that not only do I support the Irish Republicans, but I do think the entire Isle should be the greater kingdom of Ireland.
We unite in the counties.
All the counties are going to be united under their rightful rulers, which is Ireland.
Tiak fight our law.
Is this now an Up the RA podcast?
Up the raw.
I really don't know if I can add anything more to that. Shall we get started, boys?
For those who haven't played, Jackbox Party is so good.
It's a great way to kill time, have fun, especially if you're drunk.
Oh, yeah.
And if you can't drink, Gustavo, I'm talking to you.
Shout out to Gustavo and Sam and Leela.
Yeah, if you guys can't drink, wait till you can, or I don't know, you guys are about to be going into college. You'll start drinking.
Well, I'm spending the night tonight, so...
The only person who won't be able to hang out with us is Caroline, because she has to work early tomorrow morning.
Rip.
Anyway, shall we get it started, boys?
Let's go.
Play the theme song, Caroline.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Or we're just gonna die like patriots.
There's like nothing better. There's no bigger middle finger. Hey, you want to put me in the suicide mission? Okay, I'm just gonna keep living.
He clearly figured out how to go Super Saiyan.
He wanted Schmeling dead, but he just wouldn't die.
He was anti-bank, anti-paper money, and he's on the $20 bill.
Nico just comes out of nowhere, soars across the sky. Fuck Andrew Jackson.
Oh, fuck Andrew Jackson. Welcome back to A Mouthful of History. My name is Nick. Joined with me, David.
What's up, everyone? What's poppin'?
And Cameron.
Hello.
Yes, that was totally not a third take.
It wasn't. It was like a fifth take,
I know,
so
right?
it was not a third take.
So
The quintuple.
I'm never gonna live that down.
Nope.
So we are here giving you our favorite topic, and that is the death and despair of revolution and coups brought on by horrible U.S. and Western imperial policy.
Yeah, just some really fun, light stuff for today.
Anyway, David, Guatemala.
Yeah, so this coup kind of has a special place in my heart because,
As coups do.
yeah, right? So when I was in community college, I started out as a goody little Democrat who thought that, you know, everything about the United States was mostly okay. It had never been the bad guy per se. It had been misguided sometimes, blundered into things it shouldn't have blundered into. But for the most part, its foreign policy apparatus was mostly well-meaning, which is the way a lot of liberals tend to look at things. Then I started learning about U.S. policy in Latin America. And the first one that I'd really learned about was the 1973 coup in Chile. But even though that was the first one, and that one in its own way has a special place in my heart because I got to meet and talk to a survivor of the coup, this one is the second big event I learned about. And this is actually the one that I have studied the most and therefore kind of know the most inside and out about. And so when I saw that Nick had chosen the 1953 coup in Iran that we had done earlier in the season, when I initially saw that he had chosen it, I thought this would be a really good sort of companion to that, because the coup against Mossadegh and then the coup against Arbenz that we're going to talk about today are really similar and kind of show together what U.S. foreign policy really was during the Cold War and really how anti-democratic it was.
Yeah,
Well,
so-
and that, you know, these governments that democratically elected didn't fail because, like, they weren't crushed by their own ideology, you know what I mean? Like, someone else really hindered and made them fail in a way.
yeah.
Exactly. And so taking this back to the present, which is what we like to do with history, anytime you hear people talk about the refugees from these countries don't matter, the fact that they have failing governments is their fault, they need to get their shit together. No, we are literally overthrowing their democracies and putting in dictatorships.
Yeah, the U.S. supports, what was it, 74% of the world's dictatorships? Just, that's today. They're not talking about in the 50s. That's today.
I haven't seen that study or that figure, but I mean, that would not be hugely surprising.
Yeah, and like even the term "we're spreading democracy" is now becoming a pejorative. The shtick is up.
Yeah, even people who aren't super political are like, oh yeah, the wars are bullshit.
But before we can actually get to the coup part, we need some backstory. So, David, what is Guatemala? What is the origin of all this?
So Guatemala itself is a majority indigenous country that actually has one of the highest indigenous population percentages in all of Latin America. And like most of Latin America, it was colonized by the Spanish, who created a racial and cultural caste system.
Yeah, the Spanish, quite literally some of the world's greatest monsters.
Yep.
Caste system.
Oh, is it caste instead of caste? Okay,
Yeah.
I've heard it pronounced caste, but I'm going to trust you on this. But I don't know, last time I trust you, it backfired.
You should trust me on this because I have your best interests at heart.
In this instance, he does.
All right, keep telling yourself that, Cameron. But anyway, Guatemalan society was and is roughly organized into two groups, with the Ladinos on top and the indigenous people on the bottom. And so Ladino is an interesting label because in a way it almost just means not indigenous, because it basically describes someone who isn't part of an indigenous community but it can even sometimes be used for indigenous descent people who have kind of given up on an indigenous way of life.
Assimilation.
Exactly, yeah. So, you might be like a brown-skinned person of indigenous descent living in the city or something, but if you're not really connected to that, then you might identify more as Ladino than as indigenous.
Well, I mean, like, even when we talked about Algeria, we talked about Farhat Abbas, and he was one of the guys who assimilated, forgot his roots, and got as far as he could. Obviously, the outcomes are a bit different, but still, like, assimilation things comes into play.
It was Spain being the main colonizer here. When Spain had the Reconquista, the people who controlled at the time, they let the Christians and the Jews and the Muslims all interact with each other. And then once the Spanish took it back, they exiled a good chunk of the Muslims, but the Jews, they had a choice. It was assimilation or exile, and even the ones who chose exile were treated as half citizens.
Man, the Spanish just fucking shit up. But anyway, so we have that category. Although it should be said, even though indigenous descent people can make it into that category, usually it describes people who are a mix of indigenous and European descent. So kind of like the term mestizo. Indigenous people then therefore were defined as much kind of by their culture and where they lived as their skin color. So it wasn't, say, like the United States, where it is just purely based on like how you look, or almost purely based on that.
Almost purely based on it, man. If they find 1/10 African descent in you, you're black.
Exactly, yeah. So some similarities and some differences. So overall, Guatemala was, and even in some ways still is, a majority agricultural country. Politics in the countryside was mostly controlled by the large landholding elite. Indigenous communities, on the other hand, often relied on subsistence farming, usually communal, because, largely, not always, but largely indigenous culture is more communal. And so a lot of people in the countryside, specifically from indigenous communities, had to work on large agricultural estates as part of a labor tax system called the mandamiento, where they worked for bosses who, of course, often treated them horribly.
So this is kind of like Latin American feudalism.
Exactly. Yes. And that is going to become important later. So yes, this is in a way like Latin American feudalism.
Remember, everybody, history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme.
Yep. Such a good saying.
Wasn't that Mark Twain?
I'm not sure. I actually hear it. I borrowed it from David, who says it all the time.
Yeah, I'm not sure where it originated from, but it is a useful saying. So shout out to whoever originated the phrase. So
I'm on it.
Oh, okay. Cameron's on it. Detective Cameron is on the case. So we have that general setup, although there is a sort of proto-working class developing in the countryside, because you also have a population of agricultural workers whose livelihood came from hiring themselves out to work on agricultural estates, rather than only going when they were required by the mandamientos. So these agricultural workers, some of them were indigenous, some of them were Ladino, but they were kind of like a rural proletariat. And so they were in a little bit in that like transitory line between, being feudal peasants, but kind of capitalist workers too.
So the history doesn't repeat itself, but often rhymes was Mark Twain, but unfortunately the first site that came up was the International Monetary Fund.
Oof.
Oof. But yes, it was Mark Twain.
Mark Twain, who would probably not co-sign on any of that shit.
Nope.
So anyway.
Yeah, so we have the countryside looking like that. As a whole, power again is held by the large landowners as well as the military and the church.
This is sounding suspiciously French all of a sudden.
It's just feudal.
Yeah, no, I'm saying like the control of the country held by large landowners, military, and the church. That was the setup just before the French Revolution, basically.
Yeah, those institutions, man, you get the three of them together, nothing good happens. And then, of course, we have Guatemala, but we have its giant neighbor to the north, the United States.
Not Mexico.
Right. Which Mexico and Guatemala, they've kind of had their own tensions in certain ways throughout history, but definitely not the same way. Of course, we have the U.S. in Guatemala and the rest of Central America.
I only mention Mexico right now because they'll come up briefly in part 2.
Word. So with the United States, of course, during the 1800s, there is this desire to expand the U.S. beyond its frontier. And you kind of see the beginnings of that in the Spanish-American War from 1898 to 1901.
This is kind of the end of Spain as a major player on the world stage, but the beginning of the U.S. as a major player on the world stage.
Well, they haven't been a major power since 1588.
Well, they haven't, but they're still considered part of the old guard at this point.
Yeah.
So they still get some kind of... There's still something there, and like they still have some kind of say-so in Europe.
Yeah,
but
they still have some clout.
But this is the point at which Spain is done, and the U.S. kind of starts to take its spot on the world stage.
The time of Spain is over. The time of the American has come.
And over it was in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah, the U.S. kicked the Spanish ass. It was
not even close.
The U.S. They hadn't fought this horrible of a lopsided war since the U.S. basically just kind of marched into Mexico and took everything.
Apologies for my Gothmog impression. It was really terrible.
By the way, history of the U.S. versus Mexico. That's an episode for later.
Oh, yeah. And its aftermath and what it meant for both the U.S. and Mexico. So, after the Spanish-American War, the U.S. gained territories like Puerto Rico and Guam, and also imperial control over Cuba, which, that'll come up later. And then it set its sights on Central America and the Caribbean kind of as a whole, which it considered its backyard.
I'm actually surprised the U.S. never really got involved in South America. I mean, they have, if you just kind of look at who's in charge of certain countries in South America. But it's mostly the Caribbean, it's mostly Central America.
Yeah, and part of that is proximity, and then the other part of that is South American countries are generally like a little bit bigger and a little bit more stable, so they're a little bit harder to intervene in the same way the U.S. can just kind of easily go into Central America and the Caribbean.
It's a good thing the largest country in South America isn't run by a complete idiot.
Oh, yeah. You mean a complete idiot who gets sick like every 2 weeks and almost dies once a month?
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, that would be a shame. So with the U.S. going into Central America and the Caribbean, it kind of comes hand in hand with U.S. companies that are looking to set up shop in the area. So in the beginning of the 20th century, you know, after the Spanish-American War, in the beginning decades of the 1900s, the U.S. intervened in Cuba, Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, and other places to protect U.S. financial interests in the region.
And so there's often a term that comes up, and it's sort of an extension of the Monroe Doctrine called the Roosevelt Corollary. It was created by, in fact, Teddy Roosevelt. So it was created in 1904, and it's basically stated that the U.S. had a right to intervene in countries in the Western Hemisphere to maintain stability.
Yeah, when John Quincy Adams, who is actually the person who penned the Monroe Doctrine, if you know anything about John Quincy Adams, it kind of has a noble purpose behind it. The U.S. has the best interest of the Americas at heart, and it's like a brotherhood of nations. The Roosevelt Corollary is none of that.
Exactly, yeah. Like the Monroe Doctrine ideally is saying that Europeans could not further colonize the Western Hemisphere, and the U.S. would act to make sure that Europeans didn't do that. Roosevelt then, with his corollary, was trying to modify it, supposedly to, you know, claim continuity with that doctrine, but really he was entirely repurposing it for imperialist ends.
Well, they say hell is paved with good intentions with the Monroe Doctrine. It was good in theory, but in practice, it's basically
being misused.
Sowing the seeds of U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere.
Yeah.
Yep. And of course, the U.S. generally preferred dictatorships to democracies because it was much easier to become buddy-buddy with one dictator, or even say like one police force from which that dictator emerges, rather than trying to make good with like an entire country by, I don't know, treating them like human beings and not trying to control their country.
Nah,
Well,
fuck that.
Well, also, if they can train them at West Point, that's more power to them.
Exactly. And so you see this playing out, except during the FDR years, because FDR repurposed U.S. policy to what he called his good neighbor policy, where the U.S. would not actively intervene the way it had in the beginning of the 20th century.
The U.S. doesn't really need to get involved in Guatemala anyway, because the United Fruit Company, a American corporation, basically has the U.S. interest in mind anyway. It's very simple. You don't have to do invasion when your companies will do it for you.
Exactly. Exactly.
The problem with capitalism is they run out of other people's resources.
Hey-o.
Hey.
The United Fruit Company, by the way, a major part of this story. In fact, the main antagonist of the story. They own the largest amount of land in Guatemala, and the dictators that the U.S. put inside willingly allow them to have free reign of the land when your power is basically dependent on the major power saying, yeah, you can be in charge. You're really not going to interfere with them.
Literally,
Yep.
like, basically tax-free. I don't think the foreign tax rate applied to them.
And like all great companies, they pay their workers poorly and dodge taxes, basically making a lot of money off the land and leaving the country and its people majorly poor. And any attempt at unionizing was met with what usually happened at this time when anyone tried to unionize: a swift backhand and a lot of murder.
Exactly.
To the U.S., this is democracy.
Yep. This repression against, people trying to unionize or just do anything for better working conditions, it should be said, it was both the company and the Guatemalan government that were working hand in hand to suppress these things.
Yeah. All while the U.S. looked and said, yeah, that's fine.
Yep. And so, speaking of the government, there is one figure we need to talk about going to the revolution, and that is Jorge Umiko.
Yes. Umiko, I got his name right. He came to power in 1931 during the Great Depression with a reputation of cruelty and efficiency, which, oh God.
Yeah.
And basically that was fine for everybody. The elites of Guatemala could live with that because fuck these, they're not going to mess with them. The U.S. government is okay with it because fuck the Guatemalans. And the United Fruit Company are fine with it because yay, profit.
And that's how you just really see this web of hegemony over Latin America, right? Because it should be said, these dictators of Latin America, they were definitely benefiting from the U.S. hegemony in the region. And you could call them puppets, but they were also serving their own interests, right? Like you have these military, church, and large land holding institutions that are trying to act in their own self-interest. And part of that is appealing to the U.S. in order to have that extra power for them to hold the reins of authority in their countries. And so, again, sometimes we talk about it as if the U.S. is just this one-sided puppet master pulling the strings, but these are the elite rulers of this place, and they are partnering up with the U.S. because these are the elite institutions of these countries. But anyways, with that said, during the 1920s, actually, before Umiko had come into power, because again, this is 1931 when he comes in, during the 1920s, there had actually been a mild increase in things like freedom of speech and labor rights, but Umiko quickly undid all of that.
Yeah, it cannot be understated how, for a lot of the world, the Great Depression just ruined progress. Just absolutely ruined progress. Because when people are suffering, honestly, any blowhard with the right speech can come into power.
Exactly. And like, in some places, you see things get way better just in the sense that you see these great reforms passed to help make things better. But other times, just like Nick said, you see fascism and dictatorship and repression and suffering in these just horrifying, unimaginable ways. And that is unfortunately what happened in Guatemala. In fact, in 1932, he passed what was called Decree 1816, which exempted landowners from any consequences whatsoever for actions that they took to, quote, protect their goods and land, which in practice meant even more violence against indigenous communities anytime indigenous communities try to do anything for their own well-being or rights.
Yeah, it sounds about right. That's par for the course. Like, just go, anybody out there, just look up dictator, look at lands that they pass, and you'll find something similar to that.
Yep.
Gosh, man, this one's sad. He compared himself to Hitler.
Favorably, yeah.
He enjoyed the comparison to Hitler.
I almost don't even know how to riff off of that, because it's like calling someone Hitler is hyperbole, but he just pridefully did it. I don't know where you like go from there, you know?
I don't know. It's embarrassing.
It really is. And of course, the US was totally fine with all of this.
I think what we can say throughout American history is that the American government would align themselves with fascism than socialism because of capital. I mean, how Michael Parenti described it in Black Shirts and Reds. America allied itself on the side of capital.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, fascists want in on the game, whereas socialists, they want out of it and they want to make society equitable.
Exactly. And so you really see this as a theme throughout U.S. history in general, even beyond foreign policy, where we live in a place that is, capitalist and democratic. The level of democracy we actually have is debatable because you don't either have democracy entirely or no democracy. There's like degrees of democracy, right? And these things have always been in conflict in U.S. history. The accumulation of capital and power and brutality versus the ideal of democracy. And so here, when it comes to foreign policy, you almost always see capital win out over democracy anytime the two are put in conflict. So with all that being said, going back to Umiko, his main power base was the military. Pretty much every appointee of his, from his presidential cabinet down to just local bureaucratic appointees, were military officers.
That can get dangerous because you get a military officer who gets too big, and
he's making that Faustian pact. Support me, I'll put you in, but then at the end of the day, you gotta treat the military at a higher level than the rest of the people. And obviously, that's reality for Umiko. Like, military got a lot of favors.
Yep. And so because of that, basically every aspect of Guatemalan society, super militarized. And the officers themselves were actually not even allowed to study abroad. They were trained exclusively in Guatemala to avoid being exposed to other ideas.
yeah, if you ever are in a situation where someone tells you, "Oh no, you can't learn that," trust me, they're not doing that for your own good.
But I thought those ideas always would rise to the top.
Oh, imagine that. Huh.
Do they really need, like, if they're so concerned about what they believe, shouldn't they, like, test it against other things?
You would think so, but
You would
apparently
think so,
not.
But no, not at all.
So he's really entrenched in the military, and he even has a secret police force that was nicknamed the Guatemalan Gestapo. So, really not a good guy, I think it's fair to say.
He is a proper gammon.
Yeah, I mean, again, you compare yourself to Hitler, it's like, yeah, that's all that needs to be said, right? But even though he is ruling Guatemala with an iron fist, there are already cracks in the armor. One of those cracks is that the infantry and low-ranking officers of the military received poor pay and almost no perks for their service. So you have this military force that's loyal to Umiko kind of at the top and kind of in the middle a little bit, but not really. But at the base, and for a lot of the junior officers, they don't really have any special affinity for him.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, if your power base is the military, you got to keep the military nice, fat, and happy, because if you don't, you're fucked.
Exactly. And he also favored the US and the United Fruit Company a lot more than he did the Guatemalan elite at home. And so, in a lot of other places where you would see more widespread resistance against someone like him kind of being counteracted by the Guatemalan elite at home, here, a lot of them are kind of apathetic toward Umiko because he kind of indirectly sort of represents their interests, but in a lot of ways, he is the most U.S.-friendly dictator in the area, even when it comes to the expense of the local Guatemalan elite.
Umiko, for how much of a piece of crap he is, he's not dumb. He knows that if I appeal to the United States, then I can get the full force of U.S. power right beside me.
Yeah, he knows,
exactly.
He knows who pays the bills.
Yep. And then the final crack in the armor that he has is he actually instituted a number of budget cuts to public services in Guatemala that cut a lot of middle-class jobs. So you have a lot of these middle-class Guatemalans who are cut from the public payroll, who, in another context, they might be, if not actively anti-Umiko, at least fine with him. But now they're kind of starting to become more sympathetic to the people who make up the more progressive elements of the city politic, you could say, the working class, the students, the teachers, who, it must be said, in a way are the main drivers of progressive politics in Guatemala, because in the countryside, a lot of the political disputes are more personalized. And so if, say, an indigenous community has a problem with, a local landowner, they aren't as interconnected to other communities the way, like, people in cities who are more literate and more connected to other folks, maybe from other cities and stuff, where there's more travel and infrastructure to exchange ideas. There's more of a sense of big picture connectedness in the cities. But in the countryside, a lot of the times the conflict was just more local. And so politics, when it does happen or when resistance does happen in the countryside, it is more kind of small scale. So in Guatemala, for a while, progressive politics are mostly happening in the cities, where you have the working class, the students and the teachers, who are kind of the main force. And again, you also get increasing numbers of middle class people who might have otherwise turned away from the horrors of Umiko, who are starting to like him less because he's just straight up not even paying any mind to their interest at all.
You're straight up not having a good time.
Yeah, just not having a good time, fam. The vibes, not good.
We shouldn't be joking about this stuff.
So that's how we kind of get toward the fall of Umiko. But before his fall, in April of 1944, in El Salvador, the military dictator Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez had put down an officer revolt, but then he faced a huge wave of strikes from workers and students. And so in May then, he fled to Guatemala. These events really spooked Umiko while inspiring a lot of Guatemalans, especially students and workers. Kind of up to that point, students had tepidly been organizing for some expanded academic freedom, but now, kind of emboldened by what they saw happen to Hernandez Martinez in El Salvador, they start being a little bit more bold. Then, on Teachers' Day, which is June 30th of 1944, teachers decided to boycott what was a forced militaristic tradition of joining a parade that was put on by the military government. And so when the teachers decided to boycott it, it really kind of helped add momentum to the anti-Umiko movement that was starting.
When you start hearing like teachers and middle class and working class people start calling for freedom, where's the United States? There's a thing, freedom trying to be involved in it. Nope.
Yeah,
No.
right? Yeah.
Nothing.
No, they're actually starting to get all pissy because like, oh man, they're gonna make us have to like actually get involved.
Right? If, the United States was the force for democracy that it said it was, this would be very exciting. But of course,
It's not.
it's not excited at all, and that's something we'll get to in just a bit. But in the meantime, at this point where you see this increasing resistance, the calls were still kind of more for constitutional, labor, and academic rights and reforms, rather than trying to overthrow Umiko. So then Umiko himself, he responds with martial law, although kind of surprisingly little use of armed force. And then we see more demonstrations against him increase. Then, to the surprise of many, on June 30th, he resigned.
Yeah, no. In situations like this, you have two choices: be stubborn and hope that everything works out for you, or just fucking say, no, I'd rather live and let somebody else have power, because most of these end in death.
Yeah, they don't end well. And a lot of people speculate, too, that part of it was he was in poor health. And also, some just say that he was genuinely surprised at how widely he was hated, because he had lived in an echo chamber of yes men who knew that violence was around the corner. And if not violence, at least being excluded from the elite inner, militaristic circles if they spoke out against him. And so he really did not know how widely hated he was until these things started popping off.
How could you? You look at a more modern one. Look at Trump, or actually not Trump. Mitt Romney legitimately thought he was going to win his election against Obama because his people told him, oh, the polls all say you're going to win. They were lying to him.
Yep.
And so we see this so-called transition to democracy. So you need a succession plan. Umiko declares a junta, military government, and made 3 generals to take his place. But 3 days later, on July 4th, the most ambitious of these generals, Federico Ponce, strong-armed Congress in declaring him president, basically trying to take Umiko's place. So basically what happens is that he promises free and fair elections, but soon became evident he had no intention to fulfill this promise unless he won. And what happened?
The people get pissed off again, like they do.
Yep.
They saw the BS, and they kept protesting.
Yep. And so people, they kept demanding the right to democracy, as well as, again, reforms in education, in labor, in civil liberties. And Ponce himself was fighting really hard to repress the protests, including having the editor of the country's major opposition newspaper, El Imparcial, or The Impartial, assassinated on October 1st. Here's some advice out there for all the would-be dictators who I guess hope aren't listening, but I guess if you are, here's some advice. If you want to get wrecked, or at least increase your chances of getting wrecked, definitely, assassinate the moderates, because the editor of El Imparcial was not a radical. This was a moderate middle-class opposition newspaper, And when you start taking out the middle, all right, cool, you're paving the way for more extreme opposition.
So you're saying is that future dictators are going to hate listen a mouthful of history?
I hope so. I hope they're mad the entire time. But, I mean, hey, at least we gave them one little speck of advice.
Stay salty.
Right? So, on October 19th, pro-democracy officers stage a coup against Ponce. And the two leading officers are Major Francisco Arana and Captain Jacobo Arbenz.
Ooh.
Yeah, that's right, because these names are going to become super important very soon. Yes, that ooh is exactly the right the right response. I'm not sure if that was the right response.
Oh shit!
It was a response though.
It certainly was a response.
I ran with it.
So this pro-democracy coup involved not just the military, but also workers and students that Arbenz had distributed weapons to in order to help back up the pro-democracy factions of the military. And by morning, Ponce had surrendered.
Yeah, well, at least he got to have his name as a footnote in history.
And so a three-person junta comprised of Arana, Arbenz, and civilian Jorge Torriello replaced Ponce, this time with actual plans to oversee the transition to democracy. So in December of 1944 then, elections are finally held. And Juan Jose Arrebelo, a school teacher who had been living in exile in Argentina, won the presidency by a huge margin. And he was then inaugurated in March of 1945.
I don't understand this. This is a complete off-the-topic side note, but I don't understand why we have elections and then have a huge gap between inauguration.
Right? It's kind of weird. I mean, I get having maybe like a month or something, but yeah, to have like that much time, it's odd.
Until the 30s, the U.S. elected its president in November and then were sworn in March.
That is a long
And
time.
I don't even think the OAS was founded, so they couldn't find like fraud. They couldn't find like quote unquote fraud. Like,
Yep.
sorry, what? This is not free and fair. No, but it actually was free and fair.
Yeah, and if you hear OAS and you're not sure what that means, we are definitely going to get to that in the next episode. So, talking about the man himself, Juan Jose Arrebelo. He was an educator who studied in Argentina and wrote some of the history and social studies textbooks in use in Guatemala at the time. He was one of an incredibly small group of Guatemalans who had a doctorate. We are talking tiny, like handfuls. He had tried to get a job in the Ministry of Education under Umiko, but he was rejected in place for an unqualified crony.
Of course he was.
In 1936, he left to return to Argentina, where he would remain until the end of the 1944 revolution, which he never actually participated in.
That's not necessarily a bad thing.
It's not a bad thing, but it's kind of like you're that guy in the group project who doesn't do anything but gets the A. Like,
Right? He's like, oh yeah, guys, you know that revolution we just had that I totally supported? Yeah, I was just busy, but no, it's super cool,
like
y'all.
he legit coasted to a election victory.
You know, when you put it like that, I can't help but admire the man. He might not be my favorite figure. I don't dislike him, but he might not be my favorite figure in this story, but he might be the most relatable.
The road less traveled and the path of least resistance.
Yeah, let everybody else do that heavy lifting stuff. I'll just come in here and finish the job.
And you know what? Even better, because I wasn't there for the revolution, I'm not tainted by any partisan factions or anything.
I wrote your textbooks, therefore I should be elected.
That's how I do it.
And also, on top of the fact that he wasn't in the revolution and having to take sides in any factions, his background as a middle-class educator who was by no means a radical made him pretty palpable to the majority of the pro-democracy coalition, which at this point included not just the teachers and the students and the workers, but a larger coalition, including some elites, because, again, Umiko and Ponce really represented just a cruel militarism that also economically is really kind of putting the U.S. and United Fruit Company even over the interests of the local elite. So you have this very broad, but we'll say kind of messy and conflicting coalition that is developing. So Arevalo, he liked to call his outlook spiritual socialism.
I don't like it.
It's,
That sounds like such a hippie. Like, I could just see some weird hippie at like a trendy coffee shop calling his stuff spiritual socialism.
You're going to like even less where he goes with this. Not the initial things I'm about to say, but where it goes on in a little bit. So he calls this spiritual socialism. So he claims many inspirations for his outlook, including Lincoln and FDR.
Known socialist.
And in fact, he modeled a lot of his political vision on FDR's New Deal and the similar but kind of more radical changes in Mexico that had happened under Lázaro Cárdenas, who, again, also kind of implemented stuff similar to the New Deal, but he's also doing land reform and some other stuff that goes beyond FDR. But they are generally comparable, and that's what Arrebelo is kind of basing his model of the presidency on. So with this spiritual socialism, he kind of situates it between what he saw as the ruthlessness of capitalism and the anti-humanist rigidity of communism. And on communism, he said, and this is a direct quote, "It is contrary to human nature, for it is contrary to the psychology of man, which is composed of great and small things, of noble and ignoble desires, of high and low instincts, of capabilities and weaknesses, of frivolity and heroism."
Quick side rant. I don't know where it became accepted that communism is anti-individualist. Like that you can't be an individual and a communist. Yes, on the whole, it's meant to be about the collective and all of us working for each other for our means and as a big, broad group. But it doesn't mean that you can't be an individual person at the same time.
Because getting your basic needs met could lead to self-actualization.
Exactly. Like even in capitalism, we still have families and communities. We just place it really low in importance. And similarly in communism, it's not like you're going to cease being an individual. It's just the common good is what's kind of placed at the center, ideally, of course.
Because people would say like, oh, communists, there's no individuality, but it's all in relation to material item. You can still achieve material life under communism. Like we tend to conflate, like since communists are not nearly as material as the United States is, they can't nearly be as free nor nearly be as autonomous as people, like have their own ability to self-actualize.
I love that argument of like you can't be as free. Oh yeah, no, I'm so free right now. I'm enslaved by my job and people I pay rent to and people I have credit card debt to.
Yeah.
We have to get you a mic, Caroline.
But I can choose 30 different kinds of deodorant.
Yeah.
True freedom, baby.
Old Spice.
So
Degree. I'm a degree man. But that's
Anyway.
beside the point.
This podcast was not sponsored by Degree or Old Spice.
nope, it was sponsored by Irish Spring.
Oh hell yeah.
So
That burns my arms. Like, I love the Irish, but that dries my skin up.
So, yeah, this guy is clearly not Che Guevara, who, spoiler alert, will show up toward the end of our second episode on this topic. So, we have a new constitution under the Arrebelo administration, and it creates the executive, judicial, and legislative branches, creates 2-year terms for Congress, 6-year terms for president, which, as a side note, is pretty common in Latin America as opposed to the 4 in the U.S. It has a ban on active military officers being able to run for office. So if you're in the military, you have to resign before you run for office. You have freedom of speech and organization, kind of loosely based on the U.S. First Amendment. You have equal pay for women and men, as well as equal rights for them within marriage, specifically meaning for women, of course, because, men aren't the ones being oppressed. You have racial discrimination being outlawed. The government is even given power also to expropriate some private property, such as from Nazi sympathizers.
Like Umiko.
And then you get a 40-hour work week. So that was in the Constitution. But in the early days of Arrebelo's presidency, you see legislation passed under him that has some pretty impressive accomplishments. And part of it, of course, is in the beginning, he has an incredible amount of support and excitement behind him. You just overthrew a dictatorship relatively non-violently. You also, however, are facing a lot of steep challenges because you have all these repressive and unequal structures that are left behind by Umiko and Ponce, as well as the elite Guatemalans who benefited from these structures. And so even those who were in the Democratic coalition kind of represents that old system. You also, of course, have to cast a wary eye on the U.S., particularly as World War II is wrapping up and U.S. paranoia about communism is really beginning to influence the Truman administration.
Kind of like how France took it upon themselves to get involved in Mexico while the U.S. was busy with the Civil War.
Yep.
Well, I mean, like, you have the Truman Doctrine. Like, they're giving money to countries to specifically be anti-communist. They're stepping up the game to prevent that from happening.
Yeah, and so Guatemala, because of that, really has to be careful. But they do pass some pretty good reforms under Arevelo's presidency, considering the situation that they found themselves in. They created a social security system based on the U.S. version. They legalized political parties, except for the Communist Party.
So they didn't legalize parties. They said these ones are allowed, these ones aren't.
Yep, and
This isn't like the fucking Nazi Party in Germany, which has a reason to be outlawed.
Again, I thought good ideas would just naturally rise to the top.
Yeah, if you have to ban a party or an ideology, for the most part, then you don't really trust people.
yeah, and again, this also adds to the proof that, like, this guy is obviously not a communist. And so another big reform is in 1947, there is a labor code passed. And so this gives workers the right to unionize. It sets worker protections on the job, and it legalizes labor strikes in certain instances. And so basically just a lot of, kind of common sense labor laws that there's really no excuse for there to have not already been in place. Also, stemming from this labor code, you see the creation of the CGTG, which is the Confederación General de Trabajadores de Guatemala, or the General Confederation of Guatemalan Workers, which comes into being as an amalgamation of all the Guatemalan unions. So it's kind of like a Guatemalan AFL-CIO in that it's not a specific union, but a confederation of various unions.
The building blocks are there.
Exactly. And they become a pretty big political force. So the effects of these reforms, both the new constitution and the legislation passed under Arevelo's presidency, are, one, the cities become more modern and equal and politically active, Now the students and the workers and the teachers and the reformist middle class folks are really able to kind of actively engage for change and become a part of the political landscape. Unions in particular began to exercise a strong influence, again, especially through the CGTG. In the countryside, however, disappointingly little changed. A lot of this was due to the fact that there was just a disconnect between people in the cities and the indigenous people in rural areas. There was no real connection between them. In the same, not the same way, because there's even more of a disconnect than in the example I'm about to use, but in a somewhat similar way to how maybe someone living today in the cities of Virginia don't have any connection to the rural folks who are living up in the mountains of Appalachia. Just very different social worlds. So imagine that, but amplified even more so and backed up by just, hundreds of years of being just entirely completely separate with no real cultural connections. And also there not being a lot of media and culture from the cities spilling over into the countryside.
Well, also a general just distrust of the government because, look at the history of Guatemala. Indigenous people were oppressed. And so when you have these people living in rural countrysides, right now there's an obvious distrust of who's in power because they have to see it to believe it in order to all right, we'll be on your side.
Exactly. And to them, because there's not as much stuff flowing into the countryside, they don't know everything that's happening in the cities, and so it just doesn't feel as significant to them. So the government did try some education projects, but the main problem was there weren't really serious efforts to restructure the countryside through land and labor reforms that reached them. And so indigenous people largely ignored these education projects because they didn't feel them that helpful because, if you're working at the behest of these large agricultural plantations, learning how to read and write in that way doesn't really help you. You're still being taken advantage of on a daily basis, and you wouldn't really be using those skills that you're being taught in a super meaningful way. And so those efforts largely fail. Now, you see all these reforms happening. There is, of course, going to be a response from the elites. Elites here, of course, meaning the Guatemalan elite, the United Fruit Company, and the U.S.
The counter-revolution.
Exactly. The uneasy peace that Arevalo had with the military, the large landowners, and the church, the Guatemalan elite, in other words, began to break down, especially after the 1947 Labor Code. That really was kind of the turning point for Arevalo, where a lot of people, both among the Guatemalan elite and the U.S. foreign policy or apparatus and U.S. corporations, that's when they really decided they did not like him.
And the self-report showed up. Like, oh, we can't exploit people anymore.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
and
Again,
the self-report, it's a fat self-report.
yeah,
Like,
further showing exactly what they were thinking of, and it wasn't democracy.
Idiots.
And so the United States and the United Fruit Company, which up to that point had given Arrebelo just kind of the cold shoulder, now began to consider him a threat to U.S. interests. The United Fruit Company was upset that they had to treat workers better. Of course.
self-report.
Yeah.
Ultimate self-report.
Oh, wait, we have to actually treat people with basic human decency and pay them up for it?
Awful, right? Just awful. Treating them like humans. So, the United Fruit Company tried to convince the U.S. to intervene.
Self-report.
Now, the Truman administration actually almost did, but they ultimately didn't because I believe it was Truman's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, in the 11th hour was like, hey, this is a terrible idea. We should not do this. But that does not mean Arevalo is out of the woods. And so we're going to end here. But the beginning of the next episode, we'll talk about how Arevalo himself almost got overthrown.
So, thank you for listening to part 1 of the Guatemalan coup. As with a lot of these, a lot of setup, a lot of backstory, but it was a good ride. Just a quick shout out to the patrons who have been donating.
A big thank you to Philip Beadle. Thank you to Coffin Cutie. Thank you to Estefania. Thank you to Sonia, which is my mom. Appreciate it. Thank you to Zakia. Thank you to Ben. Thank you to Gio. Thank you to Alex. And thank you to Lene.
You guys are the real MVPs here.
We thank each and every one of you. Look forward to more Patreon content.
Sad note, we're going to retire the game playing. We just don't have the time for it, unfortunately.
Yeah, our work schedules do not overlap cleanly anymore, like at all, unfortunately.
So we will try to find something else to replace that, but for now, it'll be on the back burner.
Look for more soccer history articles coming from me.
Yeah, I might have another thing on top of Nick Versus, but I really need to work it out first, really actually map it out before I continue it. But so you'll hear more of it if I come up with it.
Yeah, and to piggyback off of what Cameron said, I'm also looking to write more articles. These might not be Patreon exclusive, depending on where I want to go with things. I might do light articles for general release and like more in-depth articles for Patreons, but look out for those too.
But still look out for Nick Versus every month. I might actually start just giving it, like, letting a patron actually choose the next Nick Versus.
Oh, that's a good idea. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, thank you for listening, and we hope to hear from you soon, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.